Sarah woke before dawn, her conversation with Commander Sullivan replaying in her mind. She had torn up her letter home and spent the night thinking about his words. When the morning bugle sounded, she was already dressed and ready, determined to approach the day differently. Instead of dreading the challenges ahead, she tried to see them as opportunities to discover what she was truly capable of. The morning physical training began as usual, with running, push-ups, and the dreaded obstacle course. Sarah still struggled, still fell behind, but something had shifted in her mindset. When she stumbled during the rope climb, she got back up faster. When her arms gave out during push-ups, she switched to her knees and kept going instead of collapsing completely. Small improvements, but improvements nonetheless. Commander Sullivan appeared during the afternoon combat training session. He watched from the sidelines as recruits practiced hand-to-hand combat techniques. Sarah was paired with Jackson, one of the strongest recruits in the platoon. Within seconds, she was on the ground, Jackson's simulated attack overwhelming her completely. She heard snickers from other recruits who had grown accustomed to her failures. "Martinez, step aside," Commander Sullivan called out. Sarah's heart sank, assuming she was being removed from the exercise for her own safety. Instead, he approached her with an intensity that made everyone else fall silent. "I want to teach you something that isn't in any manual," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. "Sometimes the greatest strength comes from understanding your limitations and turning them into advantages." He began showing Sarah techniques that relied on speed and intelligence rather than brute force. He taught her how to use an opponent's momentum against them, how to find leverage points that could disable someone twice her size, and most importantly, how to think 3 moves ahead instead of simply reacting. The other recruits watched in fascination as Sarah began to hold her own against much larger opponents. "Size and strength are gifts that some people are born with," Commander Sullivan explained to the entire group. "But strategy, determination, and the refusal to quit, those are choices, and choices are more powerful than gifts because you control them completely." Sarah felt a surge of confidence as she successfully executed a defensive move that sent Jackson stumbling backward. Transformation wasn't immediate or dramatic. Sarah still struggled with many physical challenges, still finished last in most exercises. But her approach had changed completely. She began studying tactics and strategy in her free time, learning everything she could about military history and combat psychology. She realized that her analytical mind, which seemed useless in physical challenges, was actually a tremendous asset in strategic thinking. During a war game simulation later that week, Sarah's team was assigned what seemed like an impossible mission. They had to retrieve intelligence from a heavily defended position while outnumbered 3-1. The other team members, all physically superior to Sarah, immediately began planning a direct assault. Sarah suggested a different approach entirely. "What if we don't fight them at all?" she proposed. "What if we use misdirection and timing instead of force?" Her teammates were skeptical, but they were desperate enough to listen. Sarah had studied the terrain and noticed patterns in the enemy's patrol routes. She proposed a plan that would allow them to complete their mission without firing a single shot. Her strategy worked perfectly. While the opposing team prepared for a frontal assault that never came, Sarah's unit infiltrated the target area, retrieved the intelligence, and escaped without being detected. It was the first time in the entire training cycle that the defending team had been completely outmaneuvered. The commanding officers were impressed, and Sarah's teammates looked at her with new respect. Commander Sullivan approached her after the exercise. "That was exceptional tactical thinking," he said with genuine pride. "You just demonstrated something that many soldiers never learn, that the brain is the most powerful weapon in any arsenal." He paused, studying her face. "Are you ready for a real challenge, Martinez? Something that will test everything you've learned about yourself?" Sarah felt a mix of excitement and terror. She had come so far from the broken recruit who wanted to quit just days earlier. Her body was still the same, still struggled with physical demands, but her mind had become a weapon she was learning to wield with precision. She thought about all the impossible things she had already accomplished, simply by changing her perspective. "I'm ready," she replied, though she had no idea what he had in mind. Commander Sullivan smiled. the kind of smile that suggested he was about to turn her world upside down once again. Whatever came next, Sarah knew she was no longer the same person who had been ready to give up. She had found something inside, herself that was stronger than muscle and more enduring than physical ability, the power of a determined mind. Sarah Martinez wiped the sweat from her forehead as she collapsed onto the muddy ground for the third time that morning. The obstacle course stretched before her like a mountain she could never climb. Around her, other recruits moved with purpose and strength, their bodies already adapting to the brutal demands of military training. Sarah felt like she was drowning in quicksand while everyone else walked on solid ground. The drill sergeant's voice cut through the morning air like a knife. "Martinez, you're holding up the entire platoon again." His words stung worse than the cuts on her knees from falling off the rope climb. Sarah had dreamed of serving her country since she was 12 years old, watching her older brother return from his deployment with stories of honor and brotherhood. Now, 3 weeks into basic training, that dream felt as distant as the stars. She struggled to her feet, her legs shaking from exhaustion. The other recruits had already finished the course and were gathering their gear. Sarah was always last, always struggling, always the weak link that everyone noticed. At night, she heard whispers in the barracks about how she wouldn't make it, past the first month. Some bet on when she would quit and go home. The physical challenges were only part of her struggle. During weapons training, her hands trembled so badly she could barely hold the rifle steady. In tactical exercises, she made mistakes that could have gotten her entire unit killed in real combat. Her instructors looked at her with a mixture of pity and frustration, as if they were watching someone try to fly by flapping their arms. Sarah's family had never been wealthy, and military service was her path to college and a better life. Her mother worked 2 jobs to support the family after her father left when Sarah was 15. Quitting meant returning to a dead-end town with no opportunities and crushing her mother's pride. But staying meant facing failure every single day, in front of everyone who had believed in her. The breaking point came during a night navigation exercise. Sarah got lost in the woods, wandering in circles while her teammates waited at the checkpoint. When she finally stumbled out of the trees 2 hours late, covered in mud and scratches, she saw disappointment in every face. The commanding officer pulled her aside and suggested she consider a different career path. His words were kind, but clear. She wasn't cut out for military life. That night, Sarah sat on her bunk writing a letter home. She had decided to quit in the morning. The shame burned in her chest, but she couldn't take another day of failure. As she sealed the envelope, she noticed a figure approaching in the darkness. It was Commander Jake Sullivan, a Navy SEAL who occasionally visited the base to observe training. She had heard stories about him. A legend who had completed impossible missions and saved countless lives. Commander Sullivan sat down beside her without invitation. His presence was both intimidating and oddly comforting. "I've been watching you, Martinez," he said quietly. Sarah braced herself for another lecture about finding a new dream. Instead, he surprised her. "You remind me of someone I used to know. Someone who also struggled with every single challenge put in front of him." He told her about his own early days in training, about a young man who was so weak he couldn't complete a single pull-up. That man had been laughed at, written off, and told he would never make it. Sarah listened in amazement as she realized he was talking about himself. The legendary SEAL commander had once been exactly where she was now, broken, defeated, and ready to give up. "The difference between quitting and succeeding isn't about being the strongest or the fastest," Commander Sullivan explained. "It's about finding the reason that's bigger than your fear, bigger than your pain, and bigger than your doubt." He looked at her with intense eyes that had seen combat and triumph. "What's your reason, Martinez?" Sarah thought about her mother's proud smile when she enlisted, about her brother's encouragement, about the little girl she used to be who dreamed of wearing a uniform. She thought about all the women who had fought for the right to serve, who had opened doors that she was now trying to walk through. Her reason wasn't just about her anymore. It was about proving that determination could overcome natural ability. Commander Sullivan stood to leave, but turned back with one final message. Tomorrow I'm going to give you something that might change everything, but only if you're willing to stop seeing yourself as the weakest person here and start seeing yourself as someone with untapped potential. He walked away, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts and a spark of hope she hadn't felt in weeks. Commander Sullivan led Sarah to a secure briefing room she had never seen before. Maps covered the walls, and classified documents were spread across a large table. The gravity of the situation hit her immediately. This wasn't another training exercise. Real intelligence officers and senior military personnel filled the room, their faces serious and focused. Sarah felt completely out of place among these seasoned professionals. "Gentlemen, this is Recruit Martinez," Commander Sullivan announced. "She's going to help us solve a problem that has stumped everyone in this room for the past 3 days." Sarah's stomach dropped. These were some of the most experienced military minds on the base, and she was just a struggling recruit who couldn't even complete basic physical training consistently. The briefing officer explained the situation. A group of enemy combatants had taken hostages in a remote compound. The location was heavily fortified, surrounded by open ground that made any direct assault impossible. Drone surveillance showed multiple armed guards, defensive positions, and innocent civilians mixed among the targets. Every conventional rescue plan had been rejected as too risky or likely to result in hostage casualties. Sarah studied the aerial photographs and reconnaissance reports, her mind racing through possibilities. The seasoned officers had approached the problem like a traditional military operation, focusing on firepower, troop movements, and tactical superiority. But Sarah saw something different, a puzzle that required unconventional thinking rather than conventional force. "What if we're thinking about this completely wrong?" Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Every head in the room turned toward her, some with skepticism, others with curiosity. "What if the solution isn't about getting our people in, but about getting their people out?" She approached the map, pointing to details that others had overlooked. The compound had a single water source, an electrical generator in a vulnerable position, and a communication tower that could be disabled from a distance. Sarah proposed a plan that would systematically disrupt the compound's infrastructure, forcing the enemies to abandon their defensive positions and create opportunities for rescue. The room fell silent as Sarah outlined her strategy. It was unlike anything the experienced officers had considered, relying on patience, psychology, and indirect pressure rather than direct confrontation. The plan would take longer than a traditional assault, but it minimized risk to both hostages and rescue personnel. Several officers began nodding as they recognized the brilliance of her approach. "This could actually work," the intelligence officer admitted. "It's unconventional, but it addresses every major risk factor we've identified." Commander Sullivan watched Sarah with obvious pride as the room's atmosphere shifted from skepticism to genuine interest. The recruit who couldn't complete an obstacle course had just proposed a solution that seasoned veterans had missed, but Sarah's involvement didn't end with planning. Commander Sullivan explained that the mission required someone who could think on their feet, adapt to changing circumstances, and remain calm under pressure. Someone who understood the psychology behind the strategy and could make real-time adjustments if the plan encountered unexpected obstacles. He was recommending Sarah for the actual operation. The room erupted in debate. Several officers argued that a recruit with no combat experience had no business on such a dangerous mission. Others pointed out that her strategic thinking had already proven invaluable, and that conventional wisdom hadn't produced any viable alternatives. Sarah sat in stunned silence, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was being proposed. "I need to be honest with everyone here," Sarah said, standing up despite her trembling legs. "I can't complete most physical challenges in basic training. I'm probably the weakest recruit in my entire platoon. But I understand this plan better than anyone because I created it, and I believe I can execute it successfully," she explained, how her struggles in training had taught her to rely on intelligence rather than strength, strategy rather than force. The same limitations that made her a poor soldier in traditional terms had forced her to develop skills that were perfectly suited for this unconventional mission. Her analytical mind, attention to detail, and ability to see problems from unexpected angles were exactly what the situation required. Commander Sullivan supported her argument, explaining how he had watched Sarah transform from someone ready to quit into someone who could outthink experienced strategists. He reminded the room that the greatest military victories in history had often come from unconventional approaches led by unexpected heroes. The mission commander made the final decision. Sarah would join the operation team, not as a combatant, but as a tactical advisor with real-time decision-making authority. It was an unprecedented role for a recruit, but these were unprecedented circumstances. The lives of innocent hostages hung in the balance, and conventional approaches had already failed. As the briefing ended and officers began preparing for the mission, Sarah felt a mixture of terror and exhilaration. 3 weeks ago, she had been ready to quit basic training. Now she was being entrusted with a critical role in a real military operation. The weak recruit who couldn't climb a rope was about to prove that sometimes the mind was more powerful than muscle, and that determination could overcome any limitation. Commander Sullivan approached her as the room emptied. "Remember what I told you about finding your reason," he said quietly. "Tomorrow you'll discover what you're truly capable of when everything depends on your decisions." The helicopter ride to the mission location was the longest 2 hours of Sarah's life. She sat surrounded by elite soldiers, each one a veteran of multiple combat operations. While she was still wearing basic training fatigues, her hands shook as she reviewed the mission parameters one final time, but her mind remained crystal clear about the strategy they would implement. The compound appeared in the distance exactly as the reconnaissance photos had shown, but seeing it in person made the challenge seem even more daunting. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter, watchtowers provided overlapping fields of fire, and the hostages were being held in the central building with no clear escape routes. Any conventional rescue attempt would result in a bloodbath. Commander Sullivan established the command post 2 miles from the target, hidden in dense forest. Sarah found herself at the center of a sophisticated operation, involving communication specialists, sniper teams, and technical experts who would execute various elements of her plan. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her shoulders, like a physical force. "Phase 1 begins now," Sarah announced into her headset, her voice steadier than she felt. The first part of her strategy involved cutting power to the compound, forcing the enemies to rely on backup generators that were exposed and vulnerable. A specialized team moved into position, using night vision equipment to approach the electrical infrastructure. The power cut went perfectly, plunging the compound into darkness for exactly 37 seconds before emergency lighting activated. Sarah monitored radio intercepts as confusion spread among the guards. They had expected a direct assault following the power outage, but nothing happened. The psychological pressure was already beginning to work. Phase 2 targeted the water supply. Rather than cutting it off completely, Sarah's plan called for introducing a harmless but foul-tasting chemical that would make the water undrinkable. The psychological effect was immediate. Radio chatter revealed growing concern among the compound's occupants about the possibility of poisoning. Fear was becoming their enemy's greatest weakness. "They're starting to argue among themselves," reported the communications specialist monitoring enemy radio traffic. Sarah nodded, recognizing this as a crucial development. Her strategy depended on creating internal conflict that would weaken their defensive unity. Stressed, dehydrated, and increasingly paranoid, the enemy was beginning to make mistakes. The breakthrough came during Phase 3, when Sarah's team disabled the communication tower. Cut off from their outside contacts and facing increasingly mysterious problems, several guards abandoned their post to investigate the compound's failing infrastructure. For the first time since the siege began, gaps appeared in their defensive perimeter. Sarah watched through high-powered telescopes as the enemy's discipline crumbled. Guards left their assigned positions, internal arguments became heated disputes, and their leaders struggled to maintain control over an increasingly chaotic situation. The hostages, previously clustered together under heavy guard, were now being watched by fewer and increasingly distracted captors. "Now we have options," Commander Sullivan observed, studying the real-time intelligence Sarah's strategy had created. 3 different entry points, reduced guard coverage, and enemies who are focused on internal problems rather than external threats. Sarah felt a surge of pride, but she knew the most dangerous phase was still ahead. The rescue teams moved with precision that Sarah found breathtaking to watch. Years of training and combat experience guided every movement as they approached the compound through the gaps Sarah's psychological warfare had created. She coordinated their approach, using real-time intelligence to guide them around remaining guards and toward the building where hostages were held. But as the rescue teams reached their final positions, Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. The enemy leader had realized what was happening and was gathering his remaining forces for a desperate final stand. Radio intercepts revealed his intention to use the hostages as human shields if rescue teams entered the building. Sarah's strategy had worked too well. The enemy was now cornered and dangerous. "All teams hold position," Sarah commanded, her mind racing through alternatives. The situation had become exactly what her original plan was designed to avoid: a direct confrontation, with innocent lives at stake. Every second of delay increased the risk, but rushing forward would likely result in casualties among the people they were trying to save. Sarah stared at the compound, her analytical mind processing dozens of variables simultaneously. The enemy's response was logical but predictable, and predictable behavior could be countered. She began formulating a new approach, one that would use the enemy's desperation against them. The weak recruit who couldn't climb a rope was about to make the most important strategic decision of the entire operation. "I have an idea," she announced to the command post, her voice carrying a confidence that surprised even herself. "But it's going to require perfect timing and absolute trust in the plan." Commander Sullivan looked at her with complete faith, knowing that the person who had brought them this far was capable of seeing them through to the end. The final phase of Sarah's strategy was about to begin, and with it, the ultimate test of whether intelligence and determination could triumph over force and desperation. Sarah's final strategy was the most audacious part of her entire plan. Instead of trying to outfight a desperate enemy, she would use their own psychology to create the rescue opportunity. Her idea was to make the enemy believe they had found an escape route, drawing them away from the hostages voluntarily rather than forcing a confrontation where innocent people could be hurt. "We're going to give them exactly what they think they want," Sarah explained to the tense command post. "A way out that appears safe but actually leads them directly into our hands." She outlined a deception plan that would convince the enemy leader that a specific route offered escape, while actually channeling him and his remaining forces into a carefully prepared trap. The plan required precise coordination between multiple teams. Sarah directed specialists to create false radio chatter suggesting that rescue forces were concentrating on the compound's north side, while carefully planted evidence would indicate that the south approach remained unmonitored. In reality, the south route led directly to where Commander Sullivan's best soldiers were positioned and waiting. "This is incredibly risky," admitted the mission commander. "If they see through the deception, we'll have lost our best opportunity and possibly endangered the hostages further." Sarah understood the stakes, but she also understood human psychology under extreme stress. Desperate people wanted to believe in escape routes, and she was offering them one that seemed perfectly believable. The deception began with staged radio communications designed to be intercepted. Sarah's team created conversations about repositioning forces, concerns about the south perimeter being undermanned, and fictional problems with surveillance equipment in that area. Every word was calculated to make the enemy believe they had discovered intelligence that their captors didn't realize they were sharing. Simultaneously, Sarah orchestrated subtle physical evidence to support the fake intelligence. A deliberately abandoned piece of equipment here, tire tracks suggesting vehicles had left the south area, even carefully controlled movement by her own forces that would be visible to enemy observation. The goal was to create a convincing narrative that the south route offered genuine escape. "Enemy radio chatter is increasing," reported the communications specialist. "They're discussing movement options and specifically mentioning the south approach." Sarah felt her heart racing as she realized her psychological manipulation was working. The enemy was beginning to believe they had found their way out of an impossible situation. The critical moment came when thermal imaging showed the enemy forces beginning to move. The leader had made his decision. He would attempt to escape through the south route, taking 2 hostages as insurance while leaving the others behind with minimal guards. It was exactly what Sarah had hoped for, splitting the enemy forces and reducing the immediate threat to most of the hostages. Rescue teams Alpha and Beta, prepare for hostage extraction from the main building, Sarah coordinated. Team Charlie, the package is coming your way with 2 companions. Her calm, professional tone masked the intensity of orchestrating multiple life-or-death operations simultaneously. The recruit who had struggled with basic training was now commanding elite soldiers in combat. The hostage extraction went flawlessly. With most of the guards gone and those remaining focused on the supposed escape attempt, rescue teams entered the main building and secured 6 hostages without firing a single shot. Sarah watched the evacuation through her monitors, feeling tremendous relief as innocent people were carried to safety by professional soldiers. Meanwhile, the enemy leader and his remaining forces walked directly into Commander Sullivan's trap. The escape route Sarah had made so attractive led to a carefully prepared ambush site where overwhelming force awaited them. When the shooting started, it was brief and decisive. The enemy was captured, the remaining hostages were freed unharmed, and the mission was completed with 0 civilian casualties. Outstanding work, Martinez, Commander Sullivan said as reports of complete success flooded the command post. Your strategy saved lives and accomplished something that conventional approaches couldn't achieve. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had happened. In less than 24 hours, she had gone from struggling recruit to successful tactical coordinator of a major military operation. The helicopter ride back to base was completely different from the journey out. The same elite soldiers who had looked at her with skepticism now treated her with genuine respect. She had proven that intelligence and strategic thinking were just as valuable as physical prowess in military operations. More importantly, she had proven it to herself. As they flew through the night sky, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. Weeks ago, she had been ready to quit because she couldn't climb a rope or complete an obstacle course. Tonight, she had successfully coordinated a complex rescue mission that saved innocent lives. The same analytical mind that seemed useless in physical training had become her greatest strength in strategic operations. Commander Sullivan sat beside her during the flight, sharing stories of other unconventional soldiers who had found their calling in unexpected ways. Sarah realized that her struggles in basic training hadn't been signs of weakness. They had been preparation for discovering strengths she never knew she possessed. Sometimes the most difficult paths led to the most rewarding destinations. The Sao base appeared in the distance, and Sarah knew that returning meant facing her regular training routine once again. But everything had changed now. She was no longer the recruit who couldn't pass basic training. She was someone who had proven her worth in the most demanding circumstances possible. Sarah returned to basic training the next morning, but everything had changed in ways that weren't immediately visible to her fellow recruits. She still struggled with the obstacle course, still finished last in most physical challenges, but her perspective had been transformed completely. The same exercises that once seemed impossible now felt like preparation for something greater. Word of the successful mission had spread quietly through the base command, though the classified nature meant that details remained secret. Sarah's drill sergeants began treating her differently, not with the frustrated pity she had grown accustomed to, but with a subtle respect that acknowledged abilities beyond what they could see in physical training. Commander Sullivan visited her during a break in training activities, finding her alone as she practiced rope climbing techniques that had frustrated her for weeks. "You know," he said with a slight smile, "the mission you coordinated saved 8 innocent lives. That's more impact than most soldiers have in entire careers, and you accomplished it before even completing basic training." Sarah paused her climbing attempt, looking at him with newfound understanding. "I finally realized something important," she replied. "I was measuring myself against the wrong standards. I kept trying to be the soldier I thought I was supposed to be instead of becoming the soldier I actually am." She gestured toward the rope that had defeated her so many times. "This still challenges me, but it doesn't define me anymore. Her fellow recruits began noticing the change in Sarah's demeanor. Though they couldn't identify exactly what was different, she approached every challenge with the same determination, but without the desperate fear of failure that had previously consumed her. When she fell during exercises, she got up faster. When she struggled with physical tasks, she found alternative approaches that played to her strengths. The transformation became evident during a complex tactical exercise designed to test strategic thinking under pressure. Multiple teams were given scenarios that required quick decision-making, resource allocation, and coordination under simulated combat conditions. Sarah's team found themselves facing what appeared to be an impossible situation with limited resources and overwhelming opposition. While other teams attempted direct confrontation or called for additional support, Sarah analyzed the scenario from a completely different angle. She recognized patterns in the simulated enemy behavior and identified psychological weaknesses that could be exploited without direct conflict. Her team executed a strategy that neutralized the opposition through misdirection and superior intelligence, rather than firepower. "Martinez, that was exceptional tactical analysis," the training instructor announced to the entire group. "Your approach demonstrated advanced strategic thinking that typically takes years to develop." Sarah felt pride swell in her chest, but, more importantly, she saw respect in the eyes of recruits who had previously dismissed her as the weakest member of their unit. The obstacle course remained her greatest physical challenge, but Sarah's approach had evolved completely. She studied each element, identifying the most efficient techniques for someone with her build and abilities. She practiced individual components repeatedly, building muscle memory and confidence in areas where she had previously felt hopeless. Progress was slow but steady. More importantly, Sarah began helping other recruits who struggled with different aspects of training. Her analytical mind proved invaluable for identifying why individuals were having difficulties and suggesting alternative approaches. The recruit who had once been viewed as a burden to the unit was becoming a valuable resource for solving training problems. Commander Sullivan observed her progress during his periodic visits, noting how Sarah had learned to leverage her intellectual strengths while steadily improving her physical capabilities. "The most successful special operations soldiers aren't necessarily the strongest or fastest," he told her during one conversation. "They're the ones who can think clearly under pressure and adapt to any situation." As basic training neared completion, Sarah's transformation was evident to everyone who had witnessed her journey. She still wasn't the fastest runner or strongest climber, but she had become something more valuable. A tactical thinker who could solve problems that others couldn't even recognize. Her confidence had grown not from physical achievements, but from understanding her unique capabilities. The final challenge of basic training was a comprehensive field exercise that tested every skill recruits had learned. Sarah's unit faced a complex scenario requiring multiple objectives to be completed simultaneously, with limited resources and time constraints. As the unit leader surveyed the situation, he turned to Sarah for her assessment. Sarah studied the parameters, her mind immediately recognizing the optimal approach. She proposed a strategy that would allow different team members to utilize their individual strengths while compensating for each other's weaknesses. The plan required precise coordination and trust, but it offered the best chance of success for the entire unit. The exercise concluded with Sarah's unit achieving their objectives more efficiently than any other group in their training cycle. As her fellow recruits celebrated their success, Sarah realized that she had finally found her place in military service. She wasn't the soldier she had originally imagined becoming, but she was exactly the soldier the military needed. Standing at the graduation ceremony weeks later, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her from the brink of quitting to becoming a respected strategic thinker. Commander Sullivan's belief in her potential had changed everything, but the real transformation had come from within. She had learned that strength came in many forms, and that determination combined with intelligence could overcome any limitation. The weak recruit who couldn't pass basic training had become a soldier ready to serve her country in ways she had never imagined possible.